Class, I am really especially delighted to present Professor John McIntyre on the faculty for many years. He and I have been friends for a long time. He is truly one of our most outstanding professors, and I'm so thrilled and delighted that he was able to come to our class today to talk to us about Beethoven. I want to tell you a little bit about John. His resume goes on forever and ever. Briefly, he's a native of Toronto, and while he was there, he won the Ravel Medal, which is a very prestigious award for performance of French music. And later, he studied at the Paris Conservatory. He has a master's degree in performance from Boston University, and he has also concertized throughout Europe and Russia. He's performed on television, lots of concerts on National Public Radio, and he recently returned from a concert, several recitals in Copenhagen. So he's really performed a lot, and in addition to that, he's an outstanding professor. So, welcome to the class, and thank you so much for coming. You know, when I first asked you to talk to our class, I was thinking that probably we would talk about Ravel or French music because you have an international reputation in the field of French music. And then as we talked more and more, you were talking about your love of Beethoven, and I was like, well, yes, let's talk about Beethoven.
I have a passionate interest in Beethoven. I love Beethoven tremendously.
And so, just briefly, and I know this is something you can't sum up in a couple of sentences, but what is this passion that not just you, but practically everybody has for Beethoven?
Well, his music is so incredibly powerful and communicative. Everything he wrote doesn't just speak of structure and form, but it gets to your heart and your feelings, and that's what I love about it. So.
That's great. You know, the class has just started to study Beethoven, but we did the Romantic period first, and practically every composer in the Romantic period that we studied, there was a reference to, and they loved Beethoven. Mm-hmm. And composers learned to compose by studying Beethoven's manuscripts, and Brahms didn't even want to write a symphony after Beethoven's Ninth. And just down the line, all of these composers were inspired by Beethoven. So I'm hoping that we can give the class, present to the class, some really interesting comments about Beethoven's life, what he was like, what he suffered, what he endured, and ultimately what that did in the music.
Great.
So could we start just a little bit about his childhood?
Sure. He was born in the city of Bonn, which was a rather small German city of about 10,000 people, mm-hmm. and kind of a rural city at the time. And he was an incredibly gifted little boy. And unfortunately, his father saw him as a money-making machine. His father was a bit of an alcoholic.
Yes, quite.
And saw poor Ludwig as a money-making machine, much as Mozart's father had done, and tried to turn him into a Mozart child prodigy. And he forced him to practice hour after hour after hour all day. He even woke the little kid up at midnight and made him practice. And fortunately, Beethoven loved music and was very good at it. But that kind of obsessive teaching and training is a little over the top, yes. I think.
Yes.
He had a wonderful teacher in Bonn, a man named Neef, who was a very cultivated man and made Beethoven practice the the Bach Well-Tempered Clavier for years. And the fascinating thing about that is that the Well-Tempered Clavier was not even published at the time.
Really?
So he had to practice it and learn it from a copy, which is even more extraordinary.
And we should tell the class also the music in the Well-Tempered Clavier is extremely difficult.
Unbelievably difficult.
Technically, especially for a child, I imagine.
And counterpoint, and
yes.
For a child to learn this is almost inconceivable, and
yes.
Beethoven learned them and played them. So that's extraordinary in itself, I think. He lived in Bonn until he was 21. And Haydn, who was a very famous composer in Vienna, came to Bonn several times and met Beethoven and heard some of his early works and said, my gosh, this kid is really gifted, and encouraged him to come to Vienna.
So that's how we got to Vienna.
Right, right. And he went to Vienna when he was just turning 22. And of course studied with Haydn there for a while, because Haydn was a very famous and well-to-do composer who was traveling and touring and didn't really have time to work so much in detail with Beethoven. And Beethoven got a little frustrated and eventually separated from Haydn's teaching.
He felt he wasn't getting enough
attention?
or...
He just didn't feel he was getting enough detailed work.
Okay.
So...
and following that, he stayed in Vienna.
Well, he stayed in Vienna. This is where he spent the major part of his creative life. And the early works which he had composed in Bonn, many of which consisted of variations. He was an incredible improviser, and he could improvise on the spot, sonatas, variations, anything. He was an amazingly talented pianist. These skills really introduced him to the aristocracy of Vienna. They just thought he was amazing. He could sit at a piano in a room filled with people, and somebody would give him a theme, and he could do on-the-spot variations.
So he was
or a
very
sonata.
popular.
Very popular.
We were studying that Beethoven refused to sit in the kitchen with the cooks.
Well, there are a lot of stories about that. Beethoven had a very complicated personality. He wasn't a simple man. He had a terrible temper. People have portrayed him as a curmudgeon and a cranky old geezer, but he certainly wasn't. He was argumentative and demanding of himself, even obsessive, but he wasn't a curmudgeon, and he wasn't antisocial. He was a misfit, but he really wanted to fit in. He really wanted people to like him.
And they did.
And they did. They admired him. He was difficult to be with. Even his friends found him very difficult.
Can you say how?
Well, he meddled in people's affairs. He meddled he had two brothers, and he meddled in their romantic affairs. He meddled in their lives. He drove them crazy. Really? To the point where he felt he was really thought of badly by his brothers, and he went to a city called Heiligenstadt, and he wrote a very long letter to his brothers where he even contemplated suicide. And he said, "I've been really misunderstood by you, and I really care about you, and I'm really not the ogre you think I am." And it was really very painful because it coincided with his going deaf.
Yes.
And he was tortured by this, really.
And we want to get to that a little bit later. Beethoven never married.
No, he loved women. He loved a lot of women, one at a time, except toward the end of his life when he loved two at a time.
Oh, really?
Yes. But he never married. He wanted to marry, and he proposed marriage to at least two women. One of them was named Giulietta Giugiardi, and the other one was Teresa Malfatti, two women he had met and had taught, and he fell in love with them and wanted to marry them, but they said no. And I think that was the right thing to say. Living with Beethoven would not be easy.
Too difficult.
Too difficult.
Well, of course, as you said, there are lots of stories and probably hundreds of books on Beethoven, so we don't know how much are just rumor, gossip.
Well, there's a lot of that, Linda. There's gossip about Beethoven that could fill National Enquirer, for heaven's sake.
But some of this stuff must be true, like he was just really an incredible slob. I mean,
yes, he was. He didn't take care of his own health. He often was so obsessive about composing he forgot to eat, and his health suffered. He was just dedicated to his art.
So do you think the obsession with composing, was it, and I know neither one of us are psychologists, but was it an obsession he had to fulfill to please Dad, or was it a true love of composing, do you think, that drove him? Or?
It was a love of music, and he, deep down in his heart, knew he was incredibly gifted. He was very humble, and he was very, almost obsequious about his own work, and he revised pieces, he rewrote them, he had sketchbooks where he crossed things out and redid them. Even after they went to the publisher, he said, "That isn't the ending I wanted, here's another one," and he rewrote it. He was often self-effacing and criticizing even works that were famous, like the Moonlight Sonata. You know, after he composed it, he said, "Well, I've written a lot better works than that." And that's a pretty good sonata. That's a pretty good sonata.
Pretty good one.
But he, he knew that he had this gift. He knew he could touch people, and he knew he could reach people through his music in a way that he couldn't on a private level. He tried to communicate with people. He tried to be warm and friendly, and he just bristled. For instance, if he was at a concert and he heard someone playing a rather flashy, empty piece of music to show off, he would laugh out loud, which is rather a tactless thing to do.
Yes. Doesn't
and
go
it didn't endear him to a lot of people, and people were a little cautious of Beethoven's character. What was he going to say, and how cranky was he going to be today? He flipped and flopped back and forth a lot.
And so he had a tremendous heartache with his nephew, whom he
Right.
loved very deeply.
Right. His nephew was the son of his brother Karl, with the same name, and when his brother died, Beethoven had always had great affection for his son, and who even looked a little bit like Beethoven, surprisingly. But after his brother died, Beethoven tried to adopt Karl.
And how old was Karl?
Karl was very young.
Very young.
And he had a lawsuit, a custody suit, for at least 4 years with Joanna, his sister-in-law. And finally, he won the lawsuit and got custody of Karl. He didn't think Joanna was a very good mother, which she wasn't, really. He was concerned about the kid. But unfortunately, Beethoven was not a good father. He was... He obsessed over the kid. He meddled in his affairs, tried to make him cultured and force him to read, and the kid wasn't very good in school and didn't care for Beethoven's compositions or the fact that Beethoven was a genius. He just wanted to be a kid.
He was just a kid.
Yeah.
Did he play piano?
Well, Beethoven he had no talent whatsoever. And he wasn't interested in culture, and of course Beethoven was incredibly well read. He read Homer and all the classics. And the kid just had no interest whatsoever. And later in his life, he even tried to commit suicide.
Very sad.
It's tragic.
Yes.
Beethoven tried to help him with his health, with his well-being, and the kid went off and took a pistol and shot at himself and missed. And then he shot again and just wounded himself. And Beethoven was devastated and could hardly bear the thought
So the
of
whole
this.
thing was...
Oh, it was just tragic from the
Yes.
get-go.
And then, of course, the other, or the major tragedy, of course, was Beethoven's deafness later in life. And so that was coming on gradually.
It came on over a long period of time. It didn't come on suddenly. He knew he was growing deaf in the early 1800s. He had been in Vienna for about 8 years, and his deafness, he gradually started to lose his hearing. And there's a museum in his home city of Bonn that has examples. It's terrible to look at, but they're examples of his hearing aids, which were very primitive at the time.
Really?
They start out as little tiny things where he was secretly trying to hear his own playing and his own compositions, and they got bigger and bigger, and the last ones are absolutely enormous. And some of them were designed by the manufacturer of the metronome, Malzel. And they didn't work. I mean, you can't restore hearing back in the 19th century. And he grew so deaf that he couldn't hear anything.
He was completely deaf.
Completely deaf. And for his late works, he got the English sent him a Broadwood piano, which was more powerful than the forte pianos he had played as a kid, but they weren't powerful enough. And his very last piano was a Graf piano, which had 4 wires for each note in the upper register rather than 3.
Really?
But he still couldn't hear it.
And yet, and I know this is, a hideous tragedy, but I want to assure the class, he did hear his music.
Of course he did. He heard it in his head. One can only imagine his his early compositions were phenomenal. They were powerful and emotional and structured so beautifully, but his late compositions are still people are still trying to figure them out. How did he compose such extraordinary works that have the imagination, the variation, the improvisatory style, They're just unbelievable works, really.
And
And he never heard them. He heard them up here, but he never heard them
So do you think
sound.
that created more intensity in
Of
these
course
later
it
works,
did.
the
Of
fact
course
that he
it
couldn't
did.
hear them?
Yeah, of course it did, and there were rumors around Vienna that Beethoven had lost his creative powers and that he wasn't composing anymore during the problems with Karl. And he, as a poor old deaf man who was sick, who was financially destitute, who was depressed, who felt that the world had kind of left him alone, set about writing his last 5 sonatas, which are unbelievable works. They're maybe the most extraordinary sonatas ever composed.
I agree. And I'm just going to tell the class that Professor McIntyre has agreed to play one of the late Beethoven sonatas.
Second last one.
Yes, and so we'll talk more about that later on, and I'm really looking forward to that performance. It's going to be wonderful. Now, without getting too technical, just briefly, could we discuss Beethoven's 3 periods, the early, middle, and late? Can we do that without getting too technical?
Oh, sure,
or
but let's say that Beethoven didn't plan it that way. He didn't say,
Yes,
no,
I'm in my middle period.
early period, and that goes up to this sonata, and then I just want to say before we do that, that I think his piano sonatas, the 32 piano sonatas, are the greatest sonatas ever written by any composer for a single instrument to this present day.
And you have played all of them.
Yes, I have.
You played all 32 sonatas.
I haven't performed all of them in public, but I've played all of them, including the Hammerklavier, and all of the late sonatas and the first sonatas. So.
And you can make this statement because you've also played the Mozart sonatas, the Haydn, the Brahms.
And I love
all the-
Mozart and Haydn and Schubert and Chopin and Brahms,
it.
all of them. But Beethoven sonatas are on a separate level. There's nothing comparable to them in all of piano literature. Nothing.
That's very exciting. I'm wondering if we couldn't demonstrate some of this better through the piano.
Sure, I'd love to.
Is there a chance we could
if
go
we,
to the
if
piano?
we can bend those 3 periods just a little bit,
We'll do
because
that.
okay, because
We'll do
I'm not really fond of that. That's like saying Beethoven was just a classical composer.
Yes.
His late sonatas are way past classical.
Well, aren't those usually considered romantic works anyway, in a sense?
I'm not that. I mean, Beethoven was a romantic figure, and the fact that he was living from 1770 on and 1791 in Vienna doesn't make him just a classical composer. He was.
You know, I really appreciate your saying that because I think too many times we try to categorize things because it makes it easier. We just put these
that's
in little.
That's a problem with the music history books.
Yes, that's right.
This category, the middle sonatas, and then the late ones.
And I'm finding that true in creating this music appreciation class. I'm a little bit frustrated with some of the things in the textbook that tend to simplify by perhaps overly defining in a way.
Absolutely.
And let's face it, we can't define a lot of music, can we?
Well, especially late Beethoven. It's difficult to find the words to define that. It really is.
Let's go to the piano
Okay.
and look at some of his sonatas.
Love to.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So, we were talking about the Beethoven sonatas. And first of all, I think we should say Beethoven wrote other piano music than just the sonatas.
A lot of other music. Bagatelles, Diabelli variations, many sets of variations. So.
But we're just going to concentrate on the sonatas.
Let's do.
All right. So, how about starting with some of his earlier works, earlier sonatas? What would you think would be a good example of one of his earlier sonatas?
Well, he began composing sonatas right after he got to Vienna, and he dedicated his first 3 sonatas, Opus 2, to Haydn, who was his teacher. And I have to say that although some people may find a little bit of Haydn in these sonatas, I don't find very much at all.
Not that much.
No. I think it's pure Beethoven from the beginning, and his very first sonata is dramatic and strong. So can I demonstrate a little bit?
I'd love to have you demonstrate.
This is his first sonata, Opus 2, number 1. I'll just play a little excerpt from it.
All right.
Leave it there.
Beautiful. You know, certainly not Haydn.
No,
Not
no,
home.
and
The drama's there.
that's
the
right.
intensity.
That's right, right from the beginning.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Young 20-something-year-old man in Vienna. So.
All right. And so then as we move a little later.
Well, the sonatas begin to grow longer. His earlier sonatas were short, perhaps influenced by Haydn. Haydn didn't write a lot of long sonatas, especially the second movements. And Haydn wrote often minuets for the second movement or the third movement. And of course, Beethoven began to write scherzos. But I thought it might be interesting to hear one of the named sonatas that people will recognize, like the Pathétique,
Yes.
which is Opus 13 in C minor. And it's a powerful sonata. Nobody had ever written a sonata that starts like this. And
Could I ask you,
Sure.
is that first chord the longest held chord in any beginning sonata? I mean,
that's an interesting
I
question.
think that's got to be the longest first chord of any sonata.
Offhand, I pop quiz, I don't know. I can't think of another.
But let's say very dramatic.
Well, we have. That's pretty long too, but it isn't dramatic, like the Pathétique.
Let's
So-
tell the class what we're talking about. That
Okay, the first chord is a shocker because it's loud, and it must have shocked everybody in the hall at that time when Beethoven came out and played. We'll stop there.
Love that. Oh
Isn't
my
that a great
gosh.
sonata?
You know, it
I
is
love it too.
as many times as you hear it.
And the
it's-
shock of that first chord. And
It's just great. Just great. Very exciting.
now you want another example? Shall we
Yes,
do-
well, we could
move
just,
on?
I could
Yeah,
do this forever, but
let's see. You know, since we've had two examples of well-known sonatas, the first one and the Pathétique, how about the Twin to the Moonlight Sonata, which not very many people know? It's Opus 27, number 1, and it's very peaceful because Beethoven wrote a lot of dramatic and powerful music.
yes,
So let's hear a bit of the opening
that
of
would
this.
be
It's-
great. All right.
etc. And then it's a very
You know,
lyrical.
Very
and,
lyrical, very beautiful, peaceful, but
and
still very intense.
Everything he
It's-
wrote was intense. Even the soft lyrical playing was intense. He didn't write anything that was kind of halfway.
Yeah.
Everything was all the way. So,
Beautiful. That is truly gorgeous.
how about a little bit of the Moonlight that comes right after that?
I think everybody loves to hear the moonlight.
Beethoven, of course, did not name it the Moonlight. There was a critic named Rellstab who decided that it sounded so romantic that he said he pictured Beethoven in a boat in Switzerland on a lake with moonlight on the water. And of course, Beethoven was never there. And so that's all
Paints a
made
nice
out.
picture.
It's a nice picture.
Well, did Beethoven name any of his sonatas, or
He
were
did.
those all
He
astray?
named really only two. Les Adieux, Opus 81A, and the Hammer Clavier, Opus 106. But all the Pathétique, the Moonlight, the Tempest Sonata, all of those were made-up names. The Tempest Sonata was interesting. We'll get to that a little
Okay.
later.
Let's
Here's a little bit of the Moonlight, the so-called Moonlight Sonata. It's just a wonderful piece. You know, to just comment on the intensity of it, my youngest daughter, Carol, who's 17, says that every time she hears that piece, it makes her cry.
Oh.
And it's, I mean, here it is over 200 years later, and it's still affecting people, and it's still sad and lonely and like
beautiful.
Beethoven, gorgeous.
And I also want to say that is extremely difficult to play, don't you think? In spite
Absolutely.
of the simplicity, I know a lot of students want to play that because it's playable.
Right.
But it is very...
Well, it's playable, but it's to make it really work and to get the right balance is very difficult.
Sustain the line.
Right. The second movement, the first movement is so soulful and passionate and depressed and all of that. Second movement is rather lighthearted. Etc. Last movement, etc. There we go with
Go
Beethoven.
crazy.
Yeah. But the first movement is what's known. The only thing I think about, I wish that students would play an entire sonata. It irritates me when they come in. They say, I've only played the first movement, and do you know the other two movements? No, never played them. Don't even know
it
what
had
they're like.
another movement.
Is there another movement to the Moonlight?
So the sonata is not really complete without the other movements.
No, it isn't. And interesting for maybe your class to know that the sonatas were always named by key by the first movement. So that's in C sharp minor.
Yes.
And it isn't named for the second or the third movement is in C sharp minor too in that case. But in a lot of cases, Beethoven will go through many keys for other movements, but it's the first movement that names the key of the sonata.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so moving.
Let's see, where are we moving to now? You know, Beethoven had a great sense of humor. I think somebody was mentioning, well, I was sitting down here about the famous Rage Over the Lost Penny, which is not a sonata, and it's a rather amusing piece. But he also incorporated humor in his sonatas, but it wasn't quite the same type of humor. There's a sonata, Opus 31, number 1, in G major, which I think it's hysterical. Rudolf Serkin played it in Toronto before he played the Hammerklavier. And it sounds like the pianist can't quite get his hands together. and he can't, so he tries it in another key. So this is the first movement.
Okay.
Isn't that funny?
That
I mean,
is
it
funny.
sounds like he can't
That
get
is
it.
funny.
And it gets funnier, and the other movements are, well, it goes into this very goofy little theme, which I won't play anymore right now, but, and the other movements are funny too. And Beethoven did have a great sense of humor. It might not have been what was suitable for society and making him popular, but I think that's hysterical. And before the Hammerklavier with Rudolf Serkin, I thought it was really funny.
That's funny too.
I had never heard it before. I was a young kid, and I went to hear the Hammerklavier, and out he came and played that, and I was just
great.
He can't quite get his hands together.
Needs to go practice.
Yeah. The next, if I can talk about the twin to that, which is very well known, it's Opus 31, number 2. And this is a sonata that has the nickname The Tempest. And the name for this one is rather interesting. Beethoven didn't name this sonata, but it was a nickname that stuck. Somebody asked him, how would you recommend, I don't understand the sonata, how would you recommend we interpret that, or I interpret that? And he said, go and read the play The Tempest by Shakespeare. So it became known as The Tempest.
Oh, really?
But
Interesting.
again, he goes back after that rather funny G major sonata. This is The Tempest. Does it in another key. But let me show you one interesting thing, and then it explodes into this tempestuous kind of character. But let me show you something that uses the opening there in a very unusual pedal effect by Beethoven. Later in the sonata, there's a pedal indication by Beethoven to hold the pedal through a whole series of notes that blur. And it's difficult to teach students to do that after they're taught to clear their pedal. But same opening sound, but this is later.